Lost your tour group, Grandpa? Or are you supposed to be our comic relief? The question, sharp and mocking, cut through the biting wind. Sergeant Miller stood with his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips, his breath pluming in the frigid mountain air. Beside him, a younger private chuckled, the sound swallowed by the vast snowy emptiness. Arnold Bennett, 82 years old, did not react. He remained perfectly still, a lone figure in a bright red ski jacket, surrounded by a squad of U.S. Army Rangers in their winter combat gear. His hands rested calmly on the worn handles of his ski poles, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks that clawed at the gray sky. He seemed less a man and more a part of the mountain itself, as ancient and unbothered as the granite beneath his feet. Captain Evans, the unit's commanding officer, watched from a few paces back, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. This was a diversion, at least, a break from the relentless monotony of their high-altitude training exercise. "Sir, you're in a restricted military area," Evans said, his voice carrying a professional but dismissive edge. "I'm going to need to know who you are and what you're doing up here." The wind howled, whipping fine, icy particles of snow into the faces of the young soldiers. They were bristling with energy, coiled springs of youthful power and aggression, clad in cutting-edge camouflage and armed with rifles. They were the tip of the spear, and in their path stood one old man in a conspicuously bright jacket. The sheer imbalance of the scene was almost comical. Miller, emboldened by his captain's tacit approval, stepped closer. The smirk on his face hardened into a sneer. "This isn't a public park, old man. This is Army territory. You are a security risk. I need to see some ID." Now, Arnold's gaze finally shifted from the horizon. He looked at Miller, his eyes a pale, clear blue like glacial ice. There was no fear in them, no anger, just a quiet, profound stillness that seemed to unnerve the young sergeant more than any outburst would have. Slowly, deliberately, Arnold reached a gloved hand into the zippered pocket of his red jacket. The Rangers tensed. A ripple of alertness passed through the squad. It was a subtle shift, a tightening of grips on their weapons, a narrowing of eyes. They were trained for anything, and anything could happen on a lonely mountain pass. Arnold's movements were unhurried, almost arthritic in the deep cold. He pulled out a simple leather wallet, its surface cracked and smooth with age. It looked like something from another era. Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. "What's in there, Grandpa?" "Your bingo card, a membership card for the local shuffleboard league." The other Rangers shifted their weight, their impatience growing. The cold was beginning to seep into their bones, a nagging discomfort that frayed their tempers. They were meant to be running drills, practicing assaults, honing the lethal skills that made them Rangers. Instead, they were stuck here, babysitting a lost senior citizen. "All right, that's enough, Miller," Captain Evans said, stepping forward. His patience had finally worn thin. He addressed Arnold, the word "sir" now heavy with condescending formality. "Sir, I don't know how you wandered up here, but you're coming with us. We have to escort you down the mountain and figure out what your story is." He gestured for two of his men to move forward. The implication was clear. Arnold could come willingly, or he would be taken. The tension which had been simmering now reached a boil. The wind whipped around them, a physical manifestation of the standoff. The circle of powerful young soldiers tightened around the solitary old man. Arnold Bennett looked at the captain, then at the two Rangers cautiously approaching him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it had a gravelly resonance that cut through the wind with absolute clarity. "I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, a stunning act of defiance. The Rangers stopped in their tracks. Miller's jaw tightened in disbelief. Who was this old man? Who did he think he was, to stand on a frozen mountain and defy a squad of armed Army Rangers? For Captain Evans, this was the final straw. It was a direct challenge to his authority in front of his men. The quiet amusement he had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. This silly diversion had just become a matter of insubordination. He was going to make an example of this stubborn old fool. As Arnold held the worn wallet in his gloved hand, his thumb brushed over a small, faded insignia pressed into the leather. It was a winged dagger, barely visible after decades of wear. For a fraction of a second, the snowy pass around him dissolved. He was 20 years old again, lying in a frozen ditch. The snow wasn't the clean, crisp powder of the Rockies. It was the blood-soaked, shell-pocked ice of the chosen reservoir. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at his flesh. A young corporal, a boy from Ohio named Danny, was lying beside him, his breath coming in shallow, pink-tinged clouds. He pressed his own wallet into Arnold's hand. The leather was new then. "Don't let them forget us, Arnie," Danny whispered, his voice a fragile rattle. "Promise me." The image vanished as quickly as it came. The memory flashed in Arnold's eyes, a flicker of profound sorrow and unbreakable steel. The young Rangers saw none of it. They only saw an old man's inexplicable stubbornness, a foolish pride they were about to break. A few hundred meters away, nestled in a rocky outcrop, Specialist Davis shivered, but not from the cold. He had been watching the encounter through the high-powered scope of his spotting rifle, his primary job to provide overwatch for the training exercise. At first it had been a curiosity, a civilian, probably a hiker who'd taken a wrong turn getting a stern talking to. But as he watched, a knot of unease tightened in his gut. He had zoomed in on the old man's face. He saw no confusion, no panic. He saw a man who was perfectly unnervingly calm. Then he had watched the Rangers. He saw Sergeant Miller's taunts, the smirks on the faces of the privates, and he saw Captain Evans letting it all happen. This wasn't standard procedure for handling a civilian encounter. This was a hazing. It was unprofessional, and it was escalating. Davis adjusted his long-range microphone, catching snippets of the conversation. He heard the demand for ID. He heard the old man's quiet refusal. He saw Miller pull out a pair of zip-tie cuffs. This was wrong, terribly wrong. His training screamed at him. The old man's posture, his bearing, the way he stood his ground against a dozen armed soldiers. It wasn't the behavior of a lost hiker. It was the posture of a man who was intimately familiar with confrontation, a man who had faced far worse than a belligerent sergeant. Davis made a decision. He couldn't break radio silence on the primary exercise channel. Captain Evans would tear him a new one for interrupting a drill over a civilian, but he had a secure back channel to the main command post at the base of the mountain. He switched frequencies, his fingers numb with cold. "Command, this is Observation Post Alpha," he whispered into his mic. "We have a situation at Grid Square 7 Delta. Captain Evans's unit is detaining a civilian. The situation is irregular." The voice that came back was bored, tinny. "Copy, Alpha. Irregular how? The subject is non-compliant, but the unit's handling is escalating beyond protocol," Davis said, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, something feels off. I need to run a name. The civilian's name is Bennett, Arnold Bennett." He quickly described the man's appearance, his age, the bright red jacket that stood out so starkly against the snow. There was a pause on the other end. "Copy that, Alpha. Stand by." Davis kept his scope trained on the scene. He watched Miller approach the old man, cuffs in hand. He could see the anger on Captain Evans's face. He held his breath, praying he hadn't made a terrible mistake. In the warmth of the Tactical Operations Center at the mountain's base, a young sergeant yawned and typed the name into the system. Bennett Arnold. He expected to find nothing. Maybe a cross-reference to a missing persons report filed by a worried family. It was probably just some old guy with dementia who'd wandered off from a ski lodge. The screen in front of him blinked. Then it flashed a searing, brilliant red. "Access denied. File classification. Eyes only. 06 and above." The sergeant sat bolt upright, his boredom instantly replaced by a jolt of adrenaline. He had never seen a classification that high. 06 was a full colonel. He fumbled for a moment before entering his supervisory override code. His own clearance was nowhere near high enough, but the system would at least show him a summary and log his unauthorized access. The file that opened made his jaw drop. He shot to his feet so fast his chair flew backward and crashed into a bank of communications equipment with a loud clatter. "Colonel," he yelled, his voice cracking with shock. "Sir, you need to see this." Colonel Hayes, the exercise commander, was a man carved from granite and impatience. He was in the middle of a briefing and strode over, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. "What is it, Sergeant? This had better be important." The sergeant was speechless. He could only point a trembling finger at the screen. Hayes leaned in, his eyes scanning the lines of text. The annoyance on his face melted away, replaced by stunned disbelief. His face, normally ruddy from the cold, paled to a sickly white. He read the file summary again, his lips moving silently. Then a look of pure, unadulterated panic crossed his face. "Get me a bird in the air, now," he roared, the command exploding through the tent and silencing every other conversation. "Get the command and control Black Hawk off the ground, and get me General Masters on the SATCOM, now." He turned back to the sergeant, his eyes wild. My God, do they have any idea who they're talking to? Back on the windswept ridge, Captain Evans had reached the end of his rope. Arnold Bennett's quiet, unshakable defiance was an insult he could not tolerate. It was undermining his command. "I've had enough of this," Evans snapped, his voice as cold and sharp as an icicle. "You are in a restricted military zone, you are refusing to identify yourself, and you are failing to comply with a lawful order from an officer of the United States Army." "Miller," Cuff him. Sergeant Miller's cruel smirk returned. My pleasure, Captain. He stepped forward, dangling the plastic zip ties like a trophy. You brought this on yourself, old-timer. We're going to take you down this mountain, and you're going to spend a long time in a very small room explaining yourself. Maybe a nice warm psych evaluation is in order for you. It was the final unforgivable overreach, the threat of physical restraint, the sneering insult of questioning his sanity. Miller reached out to grab Arnold's arm. At that moment, Arnold Bennett spoke again. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried an authority that seemed to momentarily stun the young sergeant, stopping him in his tracks. Son, Arnold said, his pale blue eyes locking onto Miller's. You really don't want to do that. As if summoned by his words, a new sound intruded, cutting through the ceaseless moan of the wind. It was a low, rhythmic thump, 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 a sound every soldier on that mountain knew intimately. A helicopter. But this was different. The sound grew louder with terrifying speed. The Rangers looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. A UA-60 Black Hawk helicopter roared over the crest of the nearest ridge, flying dangerously low and fast, its rotors churning the air into a blizzard of snow and ice. It wasn't one of their transport birds. This was the command and control ship, the colonel's personal transport. And right behind it was a second one. The helicopters didn't land. They settled into a hover just 50 feet above them. The downdraft a physical blow, a hurricane of freezing air that sandblasted the Rangers and nearly knocked them off their feet. Thick, fast ropes snaked down from the open door of the lead chopper. At the same time, the roar of powerful engines echoed from down the trail. Two heavily modified, snow-camouflaged light tactical vehicles, the kind only used by high-level command elements, came barreling up the mountain path, their tires churning through the deep snow. The Rangers were stunned into immobility, shielding their eyes from the rotor wash, their minds struggling to process the scene. This was a massive, high-level response. This was the kind of arrival reserved for a visiting general, not for the retrieval of a lost old man. Captain Evans's face, blasted by the snow and wind, was a mask of pure, sickening dread. He knew with absolute certainty that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The first man down the rope was Colonel Hayes himself. He hit the ground running, not even bothering to unclip from the rope before his command sergeant major was right behind him. Hayes didn't spare a single glance for Captain Evans or his dumbstruck men. He plowed through the deep snow with a singular purpose, his face a mask of grim determination. He stopped 3 feet in front of Arnold Bennett. The wind tore at his uniform. The helicopter rotors screamed overhead, but the colonel seemed to exist in a pocket of absolute silence and stillness. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He snapped his arm up in a salute so sharp, so precise, so filled with profound respect that it seemed to vibrate in the freezing air. Sir, Colonel Hayes's voice boomed, somehow cutting through the maelstrom of noise. Colonel Hayes, 75th Ranger Regiment. I apologize for the conduct of my men. We were not aware of your presence. It is an honor, sir. Sergeant Miller's jaw hung open. Captain Evans looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. The other Rangers just stared, their minds refusing to connect the dots. Sir, honor? What was happening? The command sergeant major, a man whose face looked like it had been chiseled from a glacier, stepped to the colonel's side. He began to speak, his voice a low, powerful rumble, reciting a service record from memory as if reading a sacred text. Arnold Bennett, enlisted United States Army, 1950. First combat jump with the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, Korean War, fought at Sukhan Suncheon, fought at Munsanni. The names of the battles were like ghosts, echoes from the Ranger history books they had all studied, recruited as a founding member of the 10th Special Forces Group, 1952. One of the original quiet professionals, the sergeant major continued, his voice unwavering, served 5 tours in the Republic of Vietnam with the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. At the acronym AACVSOG, a visible shockwave passed through the squad. They were legends, boogeymen, a top-secret unit that undertook the most dangerous missions of the war. To the young Rangers, SOG operators were practically mythical figures, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, 4 bronze stars with V for Valor, 5 purple hearts. The sergeant major paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Then he delivered the final, crushing blow. Awarded the Medal of Honor for actions taken on November 19, 1967, during the Battle of Dak II. The full citation remains classified top secret. He concluded, his eyes fixed on Arnold. Retired from active duty 1980, at the rank of Command Sergeant Major, sir. The world seemed to fall silent. The roar of the helicopters, the howl of the wind, it all faded away. The only thing that remained was the crushing reality of who this man was. This wasn't just a veteran. He was a living monument. A man who had helped write the very doctrine of the units they aspired to be. They stood in the presence of a ghost from their own hallowed history, and they had treated him like a stray dog. Colonel Hayes slowly lowered his salute, but his eyes remained locked on Arnold. Then, with a glacial slowness, he turned his gaze on Captain Evans. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice was low, seething with a controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Captain, you and your men are on this mountain to learn about hardship, respect, and judgment. Today you have demonstrated a catastrophic failure on all 3 counts. You mistook a Titan for a tourist. You allowed your men to disrespect an icon of this very regiment. You will report to my command post at 1800 hours to give me one good reason why I shouldn't end your career tonight." He then shifted his cold, merciless gaze to Sergeant Miller, who looked as if he wanted the mountain to open up and swallow him whole. "Sergeant, you will be spending the next month on every foul detail this base has to offer, and in your free time you will write by hand a report on the history of every Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. Maybe then you'll learn that a man's worth is not measured by the uniform he wears, but by the courage he holds in his heart." The public rebuke was surgical, devastating, and utterly humiliating. Just then, Arnold Bennett stepped forward. He placed a gentle gloved hand on the colonel's rigid arm. "Colonel, they're young," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're full of fire. We need that in them. They just haven't learned where to point it yet." He turned to face Miller and Evans. His eyes held no malice, only a deep, weary wisdom that seemed to span generations. "Rank isn't about the stripes on your sleeve or the bars on your collar," he said. "True rank is about what you've done, what you've endured. It's about the men you brought home and the ones you couldn't. In the end, that's the only rank that matters. Remember that." Arnold then opened the old worn wallet. Tucked inside, in the plastic sleeve where a driver's license should have been, was a single faded piece of paper, folded into a small square. The snowy mountain pass flickered again, replaced by the frozen hell of Korea. The dying boy, Danny, was pressing this same piece of paper into his hand. It was a letter to his wife, stained with dirt and blood. "Get this home for me, Arnie," he had gasped. "Please." Arnold looked at the young, shame-faced Rangers. "This wallet," he said softly, his voice thick with a memory 70 years old, "was a promise. It holds the last words of a better soldier than I ever was. I carry it to remember that respect is owed to everyone, because you never know what promises they're still carrying, what ghosts they're still trying to honor." The consequences were immediate and decisive. Captain Evans's unit was unceremoniously pulled from the remainder of the training exercise. The story of their encounter with the legendary Command Sergeant Major Bennett spread through the special operations community like a Highland wildfire. It became a modern fable, a stark lesson in the dangers of arrogance and the importance of humility, taught to new recruits at Fort Benning and whispered in the barracks at Fort Bragg. Colonel Hayes was true to his word. He instituted a new mandatory training block for every unit that passed through the Mountain Warfare School. It was a history lesson focusing not on famous generals, but on the quiet, unassuming heroes who had forged the legacy of their community. The centerpiece of the lecture was the story of an old man in a red ski jacket on a snowy pass. A few weeks later, in a small diner nestled in the town at the foot of the mountains, Arnold Bennett sat at the counter, stirring a cup of black coffee. The bell over the door chimed, and a young man in civilian clothes walked in. It was Sergeant Miller. He scanned the diner and his eyes landed on Arnold. He froze, his face a complex mask of shame, awe, and apprehension. For a moment it looked like he might turn and leave, but then he took a deep breath and walked purposefully toward the counter. "Sir," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. He stood stiffly beside the stool. I just wanted to apologize. Properly. There was no excuse for my conduct, for how I acted." Arnold looked up from his coffee, and the corner of his mouth turned up in a faint, kind smile. He gestured to the empty stool beside him. "Have a seat, son." Miller hesitated, then slid onto the vinyl seat. Arnold flagged down the waitress. "Get this young man a coffee. On me. He's had a rough month." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of other patrons. Finally Arnold spoke, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "You know, that fire you have," he said quietly, "that arrogance, that edge, it can be a good thing. In the right place, at the right time, it can keep you alive when everything else is gone. The trick is to temper it. You have to temper it with wisdom." He turned his pale blue eyes to Miller. You learned a little wisdom on that mountain. Don't waste it." Miller could only nod, his throat tight with emotion. They drank their coffee, an old legend and a young soldier, a silent transfer of understanding taking place between two generations of warriors. When Arnold was finished, he left a $5 bill on the counter. Miller quietly placed a 20 next to it, covering both. He stood up, squared his shoulders, and walked out of the diner, a different, better man than the one who had walked up the mountain. If you were moved by this story of humility and honor, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more stories of incredible veterans, make sure you subscribe to Veteran Valor and ring that notification bell.